Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give it just a moment to allow people to trickle in from the waiting room. We may be joined by others as well. I believe we would also like to record today's webinar. So just to be warned, I believe that might already even be running, but I just think it's fair to let everybody be aware of that. We want to make sure we save this content for future viewers since it's so important. So my name is Mary Beth Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And among our many things we do with regard to teaching, research, and outreach related to civil society and the nonprofit sector, one of the initiatives that we work on is the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative. And I'm going to put the link to that initiative webpage in the chat in case it's new to you. But Civic Health basically looks at the concept of all of the different environmental ecosystem kind of things that people need to have in place to be able to solve problems together and have healthy, thriving, participatory communities that lend themselves to democracy. So it's a really exciting time to be thinking about those things. I think the interest in these themes has really picked up in recent years for obvious reasons. Or if they're not obvious, I encourage you to come get involved with us and we can share more about that. But as a part of this work, we've had the privilege to meet some collaborators and colleagues from all over the United States and beyond that are thinking about these issues. And one such partner is Urban Rural Action, a national organization that is here with us today and that will tell you more about what they do. But they have developed a training that they're going to share with us today on discerning information, misinformation, and disinformation for civic health. And I'm really excited to pass the baton to them to lead us through this experience today. I will place that Civic Health of Wisconsin link in the chat, and we would encourage you to all be in touch with us and stay connected with us if you're not already. So thank you so much. And with no further ado, I will pass to Joe and Lisa.
Thanks so much, Mary Beth, and good to be with you all. I'm Joe Bubman, the Executive Director of Urban Rural Action, and I'll be leading this session alongside Lisa Inks on our executive team. Just a little bit about Urban Rural Action by way of background. Our vision is a more peaceful and democratic United States, and our mission is to bring together Americans across lines of difference to tackle our country's most urgent challenges. And we've had the pleasure of working with the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative and the Commons for some time. So just to give you a sense of what we'll be covering during this session, we're going to start off focusing on cognitive biases and social media, the way social media can exploit our cognitive biases. We'll talk about online manipulation, and then we'll move into a conversation about dangerous speech, including the ways that we can counteract it, and really end with what you can do in this environment of misinformation and disinformation so that we can strengthen civic health. The logos on the bottom of the screen represent the organizations that we have pulled some content from in order to produce this workshop for you. So we're excited to jump in. And just to kick us off, since this session is focused on discerning information, misinformation, and disinformation for civic health, we thought we would ask what you all think are the reasons that understanding information, misinformation, and disinformation are important for civic health. What relationship do you all see? And so we'd welcome for you to jump in either in the chat or by unmuting yourself. And just curious to hear your perspectives on this question. Yeah, Emily, please go ahead.
I think I was just going to mention about the fact that I think one of the reasons we have as many issues and there's so much polarization in politics today is because people aren't able to understand the difference between information that's factual and information that is misinformation. And that's also led to, I think we've seen all these people that don't think climate change is real, and there's a lot of distrust in the government, there's distrust in science and scientific evidence, and people are making claims that Hurricane Milton was created by the government, and some people genuinely believe that. And I think that it does come down to, especially older generations, not knowing how to differentiate biased articles versus not, and also understanding AI, because I know that there are older people that look at AI images and think they're real. So I think that's definitely led us to this space of not understanding what's real and what's not.
That's such a powerful breakdown, Emily, of some of the ways that misinformation and disinformation can undermine civic health and our democracy. Um, one of the ways I interpret that great insight is that number one, misinformation can lead us to have a misunderstanding of important issues like climate. And it's very hard to tackle those issues, which is part of what civic health is all about, if we don't really understand the nature of the problem, or the nature of the problems caused by that problem. Um, it also, to me, suggests that we sometimes are led to believe false things about other groups or individuals, which then increases social division and makes it harder to come together and solve problems, which also is a barrier to civic health and a contributor to political polarization you spoke about. The only thing where I would offer an additional perspective beyond what you shared, Emily, is that I think people of all generations and ages can fall victim to misinformation and disinformation. Certainly in your experience, it sounds like that's older folks maybe being tripped up by AI. Although I read this morning that an image will show later of Pope Francis that was generated by AI was shared by Chrissy Teigen. I don't know her age, but I think she's a little bit on the younger side. And in fact, I think that one of the reasons why news literacy is being taught in high schools today is that young people are consuming so much information online where there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. Thanks for that great insight, Emily. So why don't we move on to some ways that online content may manipulate us. So what you see on the screen are 4 different common tactics that online content takes advantage of to try to exploit us in different ways. Tactic 1 on the top left is they make big promises without providing evidence. Number 2 to the right is they reduce people to good and evil. Number 3 on the bottom left is they try to sway you with what seems friendly or popular. And number 4 is they present incomplete facts. So these are some common ways that online content may manipulate us. And what Lisa and I would love is if you could put into the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4 to represent which tactic you've seen either trip you up or potentially deceive a friend or a family member, and potentially lead to some problematic behavior or some negative consequence for them. So again, the request is to put into the chat which of these tactics you've experienced or seen someone in your life experience. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay. We've got 2 and 4. 4, great. So 4 is they present incomplete facts. And you can see sort of the cartoon here is there are 2 sides to every story, mine and the one I'm not going to tell you about, which is sort of a nice, funny way of communicating the hidden agenda here. I wonder, Deborah or Elizabeth or Angela, all of whom said this is a tactic you've seen, if any of you would be willing to share an example, perhaps, of how this has played out, maybe what the topic was, how someone maybe fell victim to this and maybe ended up sharing information that they thought was true, even though it was incomplete. Angela, Elizabeth, Deborah, if you want to come off mute, we'd love to hear an example of how you've seen this play out.
I'm with the League of Women Voters, and we track mis and disinformation on purpose. And so we're oftentimes putting out either from mainstream media or from social media partial messaging. We saw a lot of that during the election cycle. And I think that it's so dangerous because when you take a sound bite, from somebody without the whole context of the story, then it really can look persuasive and valid. But at the end of the day, it is, inaccurate because it is just a snippet of a bigger story that is not being told at all.
Yeah, and it's dangerous, as you say, because it's misleading, and yet it can be persuasive and valid because the facts are not false. They're facts, but yet they're incomplete. Yeah, thanks so much, Deborah, for sharing that. And I wonder, as we look at all of these tactics, um, part of the reason, of course, that these tactics are used so widely is that they tend to be effective. And so I wonder, and just to piggyback on what you said, Deborah, in terms of being persuasive, why do we think these tactics are persuasive? In other words, why do they work? We know that they work because they're used so widely, but why do they work?
Well, going back to politics, I think it's affirming. And so if you hold a certain vantage point and you hear something or see something that is affirming of your belief, then it's just piling on. It's like, oh yeah, see, I was right all along.
Spot on, Deborah. And Mary Beth put in the chat confirmation bias, which I think is what you're talking about. It's affirming or confirming a view you already hold. And that's one of many cognitive biases that online content exploits. So why don't we turn to the next slide? And the direction that we want to start this session in is around the cognitive biases that are exploited by this type of manipulative content. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that by cognitive biases, we mean a systematic thought process in which we draw conclusions based on faulty reasoning. And in fact, there are several categories of cognitive bias because there are so many cognitive biases that exist. So if we click again, we'll see what that number is. 188 across different categories. One of the things Mary Beth put in the chat is this first category on the bottom left, that we favor simple looking options and complete information over complex, ambiguous options. Why? Because our brains can't possibly process all the information that overwhelms our brains with, so we use heuristics or shortcuts. It's why we discard specifics to form generalities. We fill in characteristics from stereotypes, generalities, and prior histories. We also notice things that are already primed in memory or repeated often. One of my favorite psychology studies comes from several decades ago when participants were asked what percentage of the countries in the United Nations are in Africa. But before they were asked to estimate that percentage, some of them were shown a number that was just generated by a roulette wheel spin. And when that number was low, people estimated the percentage of countries in Africa making up the United Nations to be low. But when they were shown a high number from that roulette wheel, they estimated that the percentage was much higher. Of course, there's no connection between the number generated by a roulette wheel spin and the percentage of countries in the United Nations that are in Africa. But yet that number served as an anchor. And so it generated this anchor bias that influenced people's guess around the number of countries in Africa. So there are all these cognitive biases that we can potentially be vulnerable to manipulation around. Let's look at one of the most commons, which is the one Mary Beth and Deborah were talking about, which is actually a slightly different one, confusing correlation and causation. So it is a fact that ice cream sales and drowning deaths rise and fall at similar rates. So in other words, ice cream sales and drowning deaths are correlated. One might then mistakenly conclude that ice cream causes drowning, which would be, of course, devastating if that were true. But let's see a little bit more about this relationship. So this is an example that illustrates that correlation is not the same as causation. Why? Here are some additional facts about drowning and ice cream consumption. So ice cream sales increase in the warm summer months. More people go to the pool or the beach in the summer months. And so the cause of this relationship between ice cream sales and drownings is in fact warmer weather. it is not the case that eating ice cream makes it more likely that you will drown, fortunately. So by correlation, we mean events and data that happen at the same time or rate, whereas causation is an event that results from another event, or an event that causes another event. So it's important to understand this distinction because online information that aims to manipulate us often will lead us to believe that maybe one thing caused another. This administration is in office, and these terrible things happened, when in fact, there might not be a causation there. It might be a pure correlation. Okay, let's focus on another cognitive bias, which is questioner bias, which is when an experimenter is trying to lead us to give an answer that might support an agenda that already exists. And if we click through, we'll see an example of how this plays out. Would you rather increase mandated testing of students, or would you rather students fall further behind? So if you look at this question, why might this be not a neutral question, but instead, in what ways is there a bias potentially that the questioner is infusing into what you're being asked here?
It's insinuating that if you don't care about mandated testing, then, or if you have a different view on mandated testing, then you think that that's going to cause your students to fall behind. So it's kind of like either you believe in it or you don't, because then it's bad for students.
Yeah, if you're against mandated testing, then you must be for students falling further behind, and therefore you're a bad person and you don't care about education. So clearly there seems to be a hidden agenda of promoting mandated testing. And that's it. The answer is likely, the answers you get from a large number of people are probably likely to be more along the lines of supporting mandated testing, since most people don't want students to fall further behind. And so when the question is framed in this binary way, it might lead to an answer that the questioner wants, rather than the answer you'd get if the question were framed more neutrally by someone who didn't have an agenda. Great. Let's continue to the next one.
Great.
And Lisa, at this point, why don't you share confirmation bias, which has come up from Mary Beth and Deborah so far?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really happy to see all of you here. So yeah, just like Mary Beth and Deborah already highlighted, one of the most salient types of cognitive biases that social media takes advantage of is confirmation bias. And so I think Deborah kind of already defined this. What we say it is basically when someone intentionally or unintentionally seeks out or overemphasizes information that supports their beliefs. And again, intentionally or unintentionally, you discard or discount other viewpoints that don't line up with your beliefs. So here is a quick example. Let's date this example to October 2024 about a person named Michelle. So Michelle had been noticing a lot of political ads pop up in the last few months, and she started talking online with her friends about who she was thinking of voting for. And then suddenly, all of the political ads she started to see were just for that one candidate that she had planned to vote for. And so based on this, Michelle thinks, oh, she's definitely voting for the right person. But of course, what happened is that she wasn't even being exposed to positive exposure or positive content from the other candidate. And so how does this work? I think we all kind of understand the mechanism, but just to break it down briefly, as we know, social media companies make money through ad revenue. And so the more that they can target content specifically to very small audiences who are very receptive to that content, the more engagement they have, the more eyeballs that fall on ads, the more money they make. And so it's important to think that, to just remember every time you're looking at something online, whether you're paying for it or not, somebody is benefiting. And so Joe might see completely different content online than I do. And what this means is we've sort of come into the online space, and not just social media, it's related to our search engines, et cetera, having ceded any opportunity to get exposed to other viewpoints, let alone really grapple with those viewpoints. So let's look at let's just do a quick little quiz. So look at these choices. Which of the following situations suggest an application of bias through social media? Who might be suffering the most from confirmation bias? We'll give you all a minute to read through those choices. And then feel free to unmute whenever you'd like.
See?
Yes, thank you, Emily. Yes, so basically can you explain a little bit why Calvin might be falling prey to confirmation bias?
I think that one of the reasons I automatically saw it as a red flag was he was only getting his information from the app X, which cannot really be seen as factual or misinformation because it's not really fact checked on the app. But I think the main part was at the end when it said that he was just looking for why one particular candidate is the best choice. He wasn't looking for opposition, like opposite views at all.
Yeah, excellent. Right. So there's a lot going in there. And I would add also by really only looking at people you follow, there's likely something in common that you have in common with those folks already that might lead you to think in the same way. And so, yeah, all of those things that what you said kind of lead to confirmation bias in this case. And so what are some best practices we can do? Again, we're kind of building up to the most difficult content, dangerous content at the end. And so a lot of these are simple application of critical thinking. So to avoid some of the cognitive biases we've talked about, what we do want to do is pause and reflect, right? So anytime you have an emotional reaction to something you see online, or if the topic is contentious, it's always a good idea to slow down and investigate further. If you're not sure what you're looking at, also better to take some time to think through it, research it, especially before spreading it further. This is especially true when things move fast in breaking news situations, whether that's election day, whether that's the beginning of a conflict abroad, et cetera. There, all of these cases are moving fast, heightened emotions. And that's related to just the general point of embracing the mindset of a critical thinker. So we do this all throughout our lives, and it's important to continue to do this as we're ingesting different types of media as well. And then this has come up as well, like you mentioned, Emily, in that example that we just saw, he was only getting his news from one source. And so one of the most important things we can all do is diversify our media diet and proactively look for new sources. According to the BBC, 1 in 5 US adults gets their political news primarily from social media. And among people ages 18 to 29, that is nearly half. And what I think is even maybe more interesting and worth noting is that among people who get most of their news from social media, they're much more likely to have heard false, unproven claims and conspiracy theories, and they are less concerned about kind of receiving those messages. They're less concerned about the risk of mis and disinformation. And so it's just really important to push back against that by diversifying not only across platforms, traditional media, social media, and also within those in terms of right-leaning, left-leaning, middle-leaning sources so that we can get a more complete picture of what's going on. So I am going to hand it back over to Joe to talk about manipulation.
Great. So let's look at a few different motivators of sharing information online. And first, we just want to draw a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation, as you can see on the left, is false information distributed by those who are unaware it is false or misleading. The intent is not to harm, but yet the effects can be quite negative. And disinformation is purposefully fabricated or manipulated content, such as the spreading of rumors, writing fake news, or distorting images. So I wonder, what's the relationship you see between misinformation and disinformation? How are these two connected?
They both are misleading.
Yes, they're both misleading and they both can be harmful. And I would add that disinformation's power really comes from misinformation. In other words, disinformation is the creation intentionally of fake content, and it benefits from people spreading that false information, not because they believe it is false, but because they don't believe it is false, or misleading, and yet it's having this really negative effect. So if we got better at distinguishing between what's real and what's fake, then we would weaken the power of disinformation. So let's take a look at some of the reasons that false information might be shared. Money. One of the things that we have seen in recent years is a trend of very wealthy individuals with different business interests purchasing news companies, buying up social media platforms, potentially to advance those business interests. We also know that people maybe in our own lives have fallen victim to scams where they see fake online content, promises of immediate riches, and of course, they're giving up their bank information in the process. Ideological factors. Often people are sharing information because they're trying to affect policy change or advance some agenda socially, culturally, politically. Organizational involvement. People might share false information because they're part of a government-led disinformation campaign, or maybe they're part of a political party or a militant group. And then, of course, sincere belief. So not disinformation, but people might be sharing false information because they actually want to help people. And maybe they're trying to warn their friends and family about something that they believe is dangerous or that they're afraid of. So continuing to some examples of what this looks like in practice. On the left, misleading headlines. And then we'll go to the photo in a second. You can see this very sensational headline of a lawmaker in Austria testing cola for COVID and claiming positive results, return shows testing is worthless. But then when you read down in the article, you discover that actually the test wasn't administered correctly. So this whole big news item is really not that interesting, but yet you already clicked on it, and therefore you helped this news publication potentially generate increased ad revenue. Manipulated photos. So this photo of a swagged out puffy jacket wearing Pope Francis was generated by an AI platform called Midjourney. And there are some telltale signs of AI generated images. It's a little hard to see, but with the image on the left, the sort of Pope Francis's hand is not sort of fully made out. And there also appears to be like a coffee mug, but I think if you were to zoom in on that image, you would see that it wasn't actually a real coffee mug. But yet this image went viral immediately after it was published on Midjourney. And again, this is the image that Chrissy Teigen shared, thinking that it was real. And again, people of all ages can fall victim to these fake images as well as deep fake videos. And I think we'll go next to a video, Lisa, that maybe you can share in a second with some audio. So this is a bunch of tweets back when X was Twitter, encouraging people to canvass for Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign. But in fact, these were all bots, basically, that were not real people. And you can see that all of the messages here are variations on the same message with just some different hashtags and slight variations. The next slide shows that what in fact is a paid post is often not that apparent. So we may think we're reading a news publication written by the New York Times in this case, not recognizing that this article, quote unquote article, was paid for by Netflix. And this big red rectangular box and arrow were in fact superimposed on this because we're drawing your attention to it. Absent that, you might not see that paid post message. So ideally, really strong news publications are making very clear when something is a paid advertisement versus a news article. Okay, let's go to Tom Cruise. Lisa, can you play your audio for this?
Yeah, tell me if this works.
Yeah.
The real thing. I mean, it's all real.
Yeah, I mean, he could have fooled me there. It's the technology, of course, is getting increasingly advanced, and therefore the ability of folks to create videos that appear to be authentic is increasing. Of course, there are efforts on the other end to develop technology that can help us discern what's real and what's fake. But this is all to say that we're much more likely to consume fake videos that appear to be real. One of the interesting things that News Literacy Project has shared is that there are all these different types of information that we are presented with. And those are in the sort of blue or purple rectangular boxes on the bottom: news, opinion, advertising, propaganda, entertainment. And yet the vast majority of those are trying to influence us to change our beliefs, our opinions, our viewpoints about things. And only one bucket of information is really about informing, and that's news. So let's look into some more information here around, we can go to the next slide, 7 standards of quality journalism. So these help us assess whether news sources are credible. And so one of the things we look at is whether there are multiple sources presented in an article that help us understand facts, details, and information from, again, a variety of sources as opposed to just one. Avoidance of bias. The information should be presented in a dispassionate, objective way, as opposed to framed using the sort of language that Emily identified earlier in terms of falling further behind without mandated testing. Documentation, there should be concrete data and evidence that supports the claims being made in the piece. Verification, right? Best practice is to call up a source or someone being written about in an article or talked about in a newscast, and checking to make sure that the facts are correct. Balance, getting different perspectives and experiences on a particular issue or event, and then presenting context so that it's not misleading, but so that the reader can make sense of the information that's being presented in a broader context. And then fairness, again, giving subjects in the news article an opportunity to defend themselves if an accusation is being made. And of course, you know, these standards can come into question when people and business interests are purchasing news publications. And one of the things that has sort of surfaced recently in terms of controversy is the choice that many news publications made prior to the 2024 election not to endorse political candidates, at least at for the highest office, the presidency, in part because of a stated fear that they would be perceived as biased if they were doing so. And yet some people interpreted that, especially given the timing of those announcements, that they were not going to endorse when they had done so in the past, as potentially driven by business interests, depending on who was ultimately elected in November. So one of the things that we're often confronted with is the difference between quality opinion versus propaganda. And this sort of connects with the earlier point. Most news sources, think about any major national newspaper, are not only presenting news, they are also through an editorial board and through individual opinion writers offering opinions about the news. And one of the questions that we want to tee up for you all is, what's the difference between quality opinion versus propaganda? So how do you all see that difference?
I think a quality opinion can be propaganda. I don't know if propaganda is necessarily considered a quality opinion.
Okay. And Deborah, when you say quality opinion can be propaganda, is there an example that maybe comes to mind for you on that? We can also come back to you, Mary Beth. I see your hand raised. Do you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about that, and I think I probably need to work on my personal distinction between these things. But I think sitting here today, I would offer that a quality opinion would be done or expressed with the intention to participate in like a greater contemplation or even dialogue about an issue, and to offer an analysis or even some like valid background information, whether that be personal or research based or whatever. And with the aim being, to be convincing about an issue, but to be willing that the opinion is being put forth in, with other opinions potentially involved. And I think of propaganda as being curated specifically with the intention of having an impact on people towards a particular end, without necessarily having any particular interest in like that thing that I described in the first example of working through and contemplating complexities with potentially other competing opinions.
Yeah, that's such a great insight. And we'll click through here and see that there's a fundamental difference in intent, as you say, Mary Beth. Whereas quality opinion recognizes that there are a variety of valid perspectives, and you're trying to make the case through evidence and through sound reasoning that one opinion is really strong and valid, and yet it doesn't suggest that it's the only valid perspective. It also, in the best practice, is clearly labeled to avoid confusion with news. And so it's transparent and explicit that it is a perspective that is one interpretation of many of news. Whereas propaganda, to Mary Beth's point, is intended to provoke you. It tries to communicate that this is the only single perspective, as opposed to contributing to a really healthy discourse where different views can be debated. It also tends to rely on emotional response and minimal critical reasoning, as opposed to sound reasoning that invites critiques and other sound reasoning. This tends to just take advantage of cognitive biases and heightened emotions to try to persuade us to change our views or beliefs. So some best practices to avoid the following pitfalls: misleading headlines, manipulated photos, bots and trolls, ads disguised as news, manipulation with the original source. We should seek out high quality news sources. I appreciated, Deborah, the point you made in the chat about the correlation between split ticket voting and a diverse media diet. We should distinguish between what is news and opinion and propaganda, right? What are we consuming? Lateral reading. So just as if we are reading an article or a book and we come across a word that we don't know the definition of, we might pause and look it up in the dictionary. Lateral reading suggests that as we're reading an article and we come across something that seems sensational, is this too ridiculous to be true? We would pause, open up a new tab in our browser, and then look up that article or look up the publication we're reading it in, or look up this event that is being written about, and see if we can find some confirming or disconfirming information about it. And that might help us immediately make sense of either sort of appreciate, validate, or reject information we're consuming, rather than reading all through the piece at once, consuming lots of potentially false information, and then forgetting to go back and fact check it. Reverse image search. So normally we search for an image on Google or other search engines, but reverse image search says, okay, we found an image like that puffy jacket wearing image of the Pope. And now we want to get a sense of whether this is sort of AI generated or authentic. We upload that image to Google, and then we can see where it originated from and where it's been published. And that might tell us a little bit of something about whether it in fact is real or fake. All right, Lisa, back to you.
Great. So, like Joe mentioned at the beginning, we are going to talk a little bit about dangerous speech, which is really sort of in some ways the apex of a lot of the mis and disinformation that we've been talking about. And it's what, as you are Action, because we are interested in promoting social cohesion, which is a key part of civic health, which is why you're all here. This is something we keep a really close eye on. And so we're going to sort of apply everything that we've talked about so far to different forms of dangerous speech and thinking through that. And so does anyone want to try to define dangerous speech? And Emily and Deborah, we love you. Thank you for jumping in, and we welcome others too as well. Go ahead, Emily.
I guess just based off of the name, I would just think it's speech that has the primary intent to spread information or disinformation just to get a singular point across without, maybe not even with the intention of good, just trying to spread information.
Yeah, you are on the right track, because it is more related to intergroup conflict, right? So it is maybe the application of mis or disinformation or manipulation, any form of expression that could increase the risk that the person getting that message would either support violence or participate in violence. And specifically, we're talking about intergroup conflict. So there's a lot of dangerous speech that's related to interpersonal violence, and that's important, and that's not what we're focused on today. And so there's a few, one thing to note is, across contexts and periods of time in different countries, there are striking similarities in the type of rhetoric that leaders or community members might use to provoke violence. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of those kind of similarities. And you can see in this graphic here, there's a lot of terms that are really interlinked, sort of related to this broad umbrella term of dangerous speech. So you have kind of a spectrum of types of content that could contribute to violence or the deepening of negative conflict. And so, for example, you have stereotypes, which might lay the groundwork for hate speech or us versus them kind of speech, which may in turn lead to dehumanizing speech and direct incitements of violence. Then you have conspiracy theories, which feed into all these other forms of speech and draw from them. And at the same time, violent extremist propaganda, which invariably will pull from all of these other types of speech to increase support for a violent extremist agenda or recruitment into a group. And so, kind of like I alluded to, there's a spectrum and different time horizons here. So often you might have the occurrence of hate speech, dehumanizing speech for a long time before there's some trigger point or a direct incitement to violence that might lead to some sort of violence, or like I said, also just increased negative conflict between groups. So we're going to go through a few examples of different forms of dangerous speech. And Joe and I have deliberately chosen examples from outside the US. And that's because we want to be able to focus on what the speech is, and then analyze it without being clouded by sort of an example that we might be, intimately involved in our context. And we're going to give you a chance to talk through that in small groups after we go through these examples. And so one example of us versus them occurred in Yugoslavia in 80s and 90s. And so prior to the 80s, there had been tensions between the country's many ethnic groups, or the sort of coalitions, many ethnic groups. But primarily, the media messages promoted brotherhood and unity among those different groups. And then Tito's government fell, there was a change in government and an opening up of society. And at the same time, those media broadcasters started recasting those relationships from brotherhood and unity towards ancient enemies and pulling back out decades or centuries old conflicts between those groups, which ultimately contributed to what became an ethnic cleansing of Bosnian Muslims and a genocide. An example of violent extremist propaganda and conspiracy theories. Some of these are happening today. In Europe, you have the National Partisan Movement and the British Hand that are using Instagram to recruit people into their neo-Nazi groups. And they're using this type of imagery of strong, sort of warrior type people to pull people in. And similarly, in Germany, you have neo-Nazi groups that are using Facebook to recruit new members. And they're even producing merchandise which looks legitimizing, and they're profiting off that to be able to continue their operations and recruit people. And where the conspiracy theory fits in is one of the main conspiracy theories that they are spreading is that a white genocide is occurring, and that is being used to pull more people into their cause. And then there's an example from the Islamic State and violent extremist propaganda and a direct incitement to violence to get people to join. And they use creative ways, social media, even online chats during video games to recruit people into their terrorist organization. And finally, I'm sure we're all familiar with the Rwandan genocide, which is unfortunately one of the starkest examples of the use of dehumanizing speech and how dangerous that can be. But after it's, to simplify it all of these examples have been extremely complex, and to go into it very quickly. Relationships between ethnic Hutus and Tutsis had been becoming more complicated in the 80s and 90s, and there's a long colonial legacy that was behind that. And a radio station, RTLM, started broadcasting that Rwandan Tutsis were cockroaches and calling for people to, quote, cut down the tall trees. And they would even put some of this language into song. And soon after that, there was a genocide that killed nearly 1 million Tutsis, many at the hands of their neighbors and fellow community members. And so these are just a few examples from outside of the US. And there is a way to look and see, what do all of these examples have in common, and what should we be looking out for in our context? So we have here a 5-part framework that you can use to sort of walk through what's going on in this dangerous speech. So first you have, what is the message? Often, some sort of dangerous speech, dehumanizing speech. And what is interesting is that the dangerous speech is not just about members of the outgroup. What you often see is that the speech includes sort of punishment of members of the in-group who speak out against them or who try to defend members of the outgroup. And it also, this has come up with our cognitive biases, it can provide easy answers to what are very complex, difficult topics. And then you have, who is the speaker? If it's someone with influence, then the dangerous speech is likely to have a bigger effect, but sometimes it can be an anonymous speaker online. And then who is the audience? The audience might be someone who is already fearful of other groups, has some sort of trauma. Maybe there's a lack of social cohesion in their community, and they might be in a stressful situation with heightened emotions, which is closely related to the next sort of feature, which is, what is the context? Dangerous speech often has the most power during a time of upheaval, whether that's social or political or economic. And so it can play on previous sort of long-standing conflicts and difficult living conditions, a recession, a spike in inequality, et cetera. And then finally, what's the medium? We talked already about the dangers of getting your news from only one source. And does that information have the potential to go viral through misinformation and through a lot of people spreading it? So we're going to give you a chance to walk through this with an example from your community or from the country. And this is sort of what it might look like. So if we take the example from Rwanda that I shared, you go through each of these 5 factors and think, okay, what was the message? Well, clearly it was dehumanizing messages describing Tutsis as non-human terms. And it was blaming them for all their problems. So providing a very simple narrative for why Hutus might have been struggling. It also, if you look at the speaker, the radio station was owned by political leaders and hardliners and accessible by nearly everybody in the country. The audience was already primed to be afraid because of many different political events in the recent past, and fears of potential assassination of some of their leaders. And then just general anxiety from regional conflicts in the region. And then the context that's related again to the context and war in the Congo nearby and declining economic conditions and drought and a long history of colonial rulers increasing divisions between groups. And then finally, the medium, this is pre-social media, of course, and in that time, radio was people's primary and in many cases only source of information. And couching it in music would make it catchier, easier to spread, easier to remember, and prime for violence. So we're going to give you a chance to think through what you are seeing, maybe what's on your mind, and in this context. So we're going to put you into groups of 4 or 5. And what we'd like you to do is, each person can just think about an example of something you've seen that could lead someone, that could be classified as dangerous speech. And then if you guys all want to share an example, then quickly you can decide on an example that you want to use to walk through this framework. And what you'll do is kind of go through the framework and then think about what was the effect of that content, or what might it be if the effects haven't fully been realized. And then we're going to pull everyone back and talk about solutions. And then you'll be able to go back into your groups. And that's when we'll do a plenary share out of some ideas you have for kind of pushing back against this dangerous speech. So Joe is going to move you all into groups. And we'll have, I think, about 10 minutes together. So Joe, we look good?
Yep.
Okay. And it looks like some people are dropping at the hour. So we'll have 2 groups. So yeah, we will go ahead and send you off and look forward to seeing you back in a little bit. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I see folks trickling back in. All right, so we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges that you are seeing and in your community or in the country generally. So we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies to manage those and then send you right back into those same rooms to talk a little bit about how to apply some of these strategies to both for yourself and to help the community more broadly. So to avoid sort of being influenced by some of the dangerous speech that we've talked about, there are a few different strategies. So this is cumulative. So it builds on everything else we've already talked about. And then add to that, consider the appeal. So what are the main factors, those 5 features of dangerous speech we talked about, and why might that content resonate with certain people? So a lot of this is about recognizing what sort of emotion is being manipulated or sense of identity or values that can that the dangerous speech is sort of preying on, that can help, that can gin up more support. And if you can spot that, then you can better manage that sort of disinformation, manipulation, and dangerous speech. And that goes along with specifically zeroing in on that context feature of the framework and thinking about what are some of the trends we're seeing, how is this part of a bigger picture, and what might happen as a result. And so always keeping in mind every piece of information you see and how that fits into some of these broader trends around dangerous speech. And so not only do we want ourselves to not, be vulnerable to some of these forms of dangerous speech and manipulation, but we also want to help sort of combat that violent content generally. And so there's a few tactics here. So one, of course, is avoiding amplifying mis and disinformation. And that can be as simple as, even if you want to educate somebody about it, take a screenshot of the mis and disinformation to share rather than forwarding it, following, responding to it, et cetera, because that's just going to increase the eyeballs and the benefits to the media companies. Also, it's important not to cede the floor. So mis and disinformation really excel at disruption and stealing the middle ground, derailing conversations and healthy debates. And so one way to deal with that is to steadfastly call out the tactics and techniques you see, or share resources, fact checks, and information from experts. And it's really important to do that by focusing on the information itself and not the person, right? So offer corrections without attacks towards the person. And that can mean messaging someone privately. Maybe someone you know on TikTok has shared something that is false, messaging them privately rather than making a big public, potentially contentious show of it. And connecting, and or if you don't know that person, replying with other sources or information. We, of course, want you to develop and share your expertise with other in various ways. Perhaps you have a specific knowledge base about climate change or the electoral process, and so you can take on that sort of leadership role. And then the thing I want to focus on most is to practice pre-bunking. So unlike debunking, which is once a piece of manipulation, mis and disinformation has already gone out there, you can debunk that by pushing back against it, but that is shown to be far less effective than pre-bunking. Has anyone familiar with pre-bunking and want to say what it is? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, so pre-bunking is the idea that sometimes you want to get ahead of what you know might be disinformation coming down the pike, and that often once a piece of disinformation is out there, it's too late because too many people have seen it, it spreads. And so there are three types of pre-bunking. One is fact-based, so correcting a specific false narrative that is emerging and that you expect to happen. The other is logic-based, so explaining the tactics of manipulation behind that piece of dangerous speech or manipulation. And the third is source-based, so pointing out bad sources of information, providing better sources of information. Studies have shown that the most effective form of pre-bunking is logic-based. And that's, again, really where you're getting at the tactics. And part of why this works so well is that regardless of your beliefs, nobody wants to be manipulated. And that knowing sort of how the mechanisms behind it can help. And so it kind of includes these very basic steps. So think about the manipulation context and potential disinformation. I think prior to the election, we all could have predicted and guessed that there would be mis and disinformation about the integrity of the elections and some of the electoral processes based on previous elections, right? So there were a lot of organizations actively working to pre-bunk that expected mis and disinformation and in some cases dangerous speech. So find that context and then pick an example. And that's something you can break down. You can break down the tactics of a piece of disinformation or manipulation that have already happened and provide that sort of warning and context. So unpack that technique. And then as you do that, then you educate with an example and share the truth, accurate sources of information, things that people can look to as they're receiving information in a quickly changing context. So another example in 2020, Twitter rolled out prompts in users' timelines on election day, reminding them that results might not come that day and that people might need to wait for them. So thinking about pre-bunking especially, but also any of the other tactics, we're going to send you back into your rooms for about 5 minutes. So think back to the example that you analyzed and think about, were any of these tactics used? If not, what could have been used to make the spread of dangerous speech less powerful? So we will scoot you right back into those rooms. I think we made it back. Awesome. So Haley asked a really good question about, or just mentioned that it's challenging to pre-bunk and that it hasn't always worked. Lisa, were you going to jump in on that?
I was. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me the last thing Haley said. So thank you. So I'm just joining, as someone else mentioned, I'm just joining this whole conversation. So I apologize for arriving late as well. But I sort of agree with you, Haley, in that even in whether you're talking about ballot box burning or just in general, the pre-bunking is really hard. I'll give you my own example that underscores why I'm sort of frustrated. Like, okay, I'd love to learn more about how I scientifically change people's minds with pre-bunking. So I'm leading the Women's Fund, and as a bit of background, only 1.9% of all philanthropic dollars are in direct support of women and girls. Now, I didn't make that statistic up. It comes from the Women's Philanthropy Institute at IUPUI. These are major institutions. They do research all the time. And when I announced that from the podium recently, I had several people question the data. And they didn't believe it. And I just thought, okay, here's an example of like, I didn't do the research. I didn't make this up. I used logic in saying, this is the research. These are the reputable institutions. And yet they didn't believe the data. And so as a result of that, in my first like major communication via email to the audience, I was thinking, so how do I rectify this in the minds of those people who would even doubt the data? I really didn't know how to respond. I wanted to respond, but I didn't really have a solution.
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. I have some responses to that, not to say that would solve your issue. Well, and one of the responses is this isn't always going to work, right? But beyond that, but I wonder if I want to put a pin in that just to see first what the other example was, to see from the other group, in case there were some ideas for pre-bunking that came out of there, so I don't preempt that. I guess, Alex, are you the spokesperson? Do you want to go for it?
Well, one of my colleagues, I had an example, but we deferred to, because the three of you are clumped together. I can't tell who is speaking, but wasn't one of you going to be our spokesperson? Or is there a sound?
Looks like they're unmuting.
Do you want to use my computer? Can you hear us?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Maybe this can be a team effort, but yeah, we discussed several instances of mis and disinformation. The first couple examples were to do with like far-right extremism and a couple of neo-Nazi demonstrations and online communication about that as well. And then we also talked about the mis and disinformation surrounding COVID. Particularly with anti-Asian discrimination and also all the mis and disinformation about masks and vaccines that was going on online. We didn't get to specifically talking about pre-bunking and debunking, but I think with the last example, the first thing I'll think of is that there's a lot of pre-bunking that can happen with posting reliable scientific information related to COVID. And I do think a lot of people were doing that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have anything to add? No, I think that was perfect.
All right, thanks, Costanza. So yeah, it sounds like we're all at this place of thinking, yeah, how can we get pre-bunking or other tactics to actually make a difference? And I'll offer a thought, and then Joe, let you jump in and take us through the final steps. But I think one is, when we have done this workshop before, we have also done it with folks who have been trained in the ABCs of constructive dialogue, which is just a way of emphasizing asking questions and checking your understanding of the other person's perspective. And in a case where there is actual personal contact, and an opportunity for conversation, we find that asking someone to share what they're focused on, what information they're focused on, what their concerns are, can help you get to the bottom of why they might be resistant to your source of information, or what it is exactly that is driving that perhaps illustration of confirmation bias, right? They're not focused on the information that doesn't confirm their biases, and to try and dig into that more. And then the other thing is, again, if there are, what it's hard, like in your case, Lisa, where you doesn't sound like you had a chance to see the information that they did believe, because if there were other sources they were citing, for example, you could look at that and see, well, if that is less valid than the source I have, look at those tactics and what exactly is being employed here, who paid for that study, or what exactly is going on that might be manipulating people. So that is that sort of like breaking down the tactics of manipulation, which is a little bit different than getting someone to believe your source fresh. But yeah, Joe, what would you add to that?
I mean, I think that was such a great explanation, right? A difference between persuading someone not to believe false information versus persuading someone to believe true information. And my only additional thought, Lisa, and first, just I'm really sorry that you had to experience that. That must have been really frustrating. And I think, as Lisa, you said, there are these pervasive societal dynamics that lead people to dismiss information about women and girls being disproportionately harmed by philanthropic dollars that is very hard to address through any sort of individual action. My only thought is that the more you can present the audience with sources of data at different times, for example, written material prior to that speech, if that's possible, follow-up information following the speech. All right, the more people are presented with the factual information, perhaps the more likely they are to be a little less skeptical of that. And then, as you say, Lisa, to engage in one-on-one conversation to understand what is driving that skepticism and how can you potentially counteract it with some valid information.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you. You just confirmed my reaction was the right one, because I just wrote a message and then included a hyperlink to the Women's Philanthropy Institute website where they can dig deep and go far. Interestingly, though, their response to my, like, I doubt that data, Lisa, was their own personal experience. I'm a donor, and this is the person talking to me. I give to education, and certainly girls are in part of the education community. I said, exactly, but we're talking about gifts and contributions in direct support of women and girls exclusively. And they said, oh, well then, who cares? That number is way off then. And again, I thought, okay, but it's not, because animals get more than women and girls. And, if you're okay with that, fine, but I have a problem with that. So it's so interesting, this whole idea of misinformation, disinformation, real facts. We had Kellyanne Conway talking on all the speaker circuits of alternative facts. Like, what's that? So it's so curious how we got to this point of even so much doubt.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lisa. And one of the places we started this presentation with was talking about cognitive biases. And one of the ones that you sort of allude to in the comment you just made was that we might disproportionately emphasize and pay attention to our own experiences and therefore de-emphasize sort of the empirical data when it doesn't sort of align with a single experience or a recent experience, right? Recency bias that maybe we've had. So one of the reasons we're vulnerable to manipulation and we're maybe skeptical of really concrete data and truth and facts is because of these cognitive biases, which makes this all very difficult. So what will you do? So let's talk a little bit about what can happen coming out of this session. So Lisa, if you're able to click through one more time. So some pitfalls that we've talked about during this session, we talked about the pitfalls of confusing correlation and causation and a whole variety of cognitive biases. So our advice is to pause and reflect, embrace the mindset of a critical thinker, diversify your media diet, seek out information proactively, seek out high quality news sources based on the 7 standards of quality journalism, distinguish between news and opinion and propaganda, consider the content's appeal, and make note of trends. And we shared some skills that you might consider, pre-bunking, which we just talked about, avoiding amplifying misinformation, not ceding the floor and instead calling out examples of disinformation and sharing helpful resources, offering corrections without ad hominem or other attacks, and developing and sharing your expertise. And so the question we want to leave you with is, what is one thing that you as a community member, as a leader, as a participant in this session, want to do or not do moving forward? And we would just invite you to share that before you say goodbye to us and before we say goodbye to you.
Maybe I'll share one that I'm trying to encourage a lot of people in my life to do, which is just to even address something that's kind of adjacent to this theme, which is not allow algorithms to determine like what news you even see. So having a conscious practice of going to sources that you specifically open, as opposed to just like opening up an app where like even the things that you do or do not see. And that's a little bit adjacent, but I would also try to practice all the tips that were shared here today as well.
I love that, Mary Beth, because one of our pieces of advice is to diversify your media diet. And what you're saying is, let's be more intentional about doing that. Let's just not consume things because they happen to be directed our way when we're doing something else. I see Amy's great takeaway on trying out pre-bunking, seeing how it goes. Lisa, Alex, or anyone else want to share a takeaway, something you want to do differently?
Sure. I mean, one thing I do, it sort of links in what Mary Beth said, is, students, what have you, to always look at sort of left, right, and center news sources, like regularly, not just on an issue, but to do it daily. Because then not only are you, if you do one issue, you sort of pop into that context, but if you do it regularly, you see the patterns through time and how certain messages are happening. Or, you can, so if you look at like Tangle or All Sides, you get on the issues, but you don't get that flow. And I think understanding the flow and repetition is a different sort of understanding, but it takes time. Now, really, you can do it in tell people 5 minutes in a day. You can just flip at a certain time, like 8 a.m., 6 p.m., what have you.
Yeah, it also helps you assess sort of the relative credibility of those different publications when you're consuming content from them significantly, and you can sort of assess the trend over time of coverage of a particular piece as opposed to just jumping in for one article, as you say, Alex. Thanks for that. Any final thoughts before we wrap? I realize we're at time.
Yeah, well,
Then I'll just say
thank you.
a huge thanks and turn it back to you, Mary Beth.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just wanted to make sure, I am going to put in the chat one more time our Civic Health of Wisconsin webpage. There are lots of ways for you to get involved and continue to stay connected to colleagues like Urban Rural Action, who we work with across our coalition, which is very Wisconsin based, but also includes national organizations that are doing work in Wisconsin. And we are lucky to have URA as a partner in a project in Wisconsin. So we get to be with them consistently. And I think we'll continue to be bringing content like this your way. There's a monthly meetup that we do, which is coming up on December 3rd, and everyone is welcome to come to those. In December, we're going to do a facilitated discussion around the election that we just had. It should be really interesting, and we'll share about what civil society organizations were doing leading up to the election and the way that they're pivoting now. The QR code there, if you would be so kind as to give us your feedback on this session, that would be great. And we'll be resuming our CommUniversity schedule in February. We take a break in December and January, but we'll be back in February. And please do keep an eye on what we're up to.